Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Democratic Constitution podcast. Really excited today to be talking with Matt McManus. And Matt, I was hoping you could introduce yourself along with your background and how you became interested in many of the topics that you write about: socialism, democracy, liberalism. But please introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks. Well, first off, it's great to be here. Secondly, just tell you my background. Right now I teach at the University of Michigan. I'm a lecturer in political science, and I mostly teach classes on constitutional theory, a little bit of political theory, the American right, that kind of thing. I completed my PhD in 2017, and I've held a bunch of different appointments, including in Mexico City, as we were just discussing, for 2 years when I was at Tec de Monterrey, which is something I still remember really fondly. And if people want, they can check out some of my books and writings. The big one that came out recently was The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism. It was in November.
Awesome. Well, I think some of the questions that I'll ask you will touch on topics that are in that book. A lot of your work points to the importance of civil or liberal rights, as you call them, and I think this is a really interesting topic. I agree with the importance that you put on these rights, and I wanted to kind of bring in your thoughts around these rights with the Democratic Constitution blog and discussions around the Constitution. So the blog and our podcast was founded on this belief that the U.S. is not a democracy based on universal and equal rights, that the current Constitution is the primary obstacle to democracy, that the Constitution concentrates power in the hands of a minority of folks, frustrates majority rule through various veto points, so on and so forth. So I was curious, what would liberals, what would a liberal, as you understand them or him or her, what would they say about this assertion that we need a democratic constitution based on universal and equal rights? And then later on, what would a liberal socialist or a democratic socialist think about that assertion?
Absolutely. So this is a complicated question because liberalism is not just one doctrine. It's kind of a family of different doctrines with different permutations and different kinds of emphases. So what we might call Cold War liberalism or neoliberalism, if you prefer, is quite comfortable with the idea that there should be severe restrictions on democratic will formation, let alone majoritarianism. And you saw this very nicely embodied in comments like F.A. Hayek's claim that if the choice was between a liberal dictatorship or a socialist democracy, far better to choose a kind of liberal dictatorship. And Hayek saw this as a liberal position, and he wasn't necessarily wrong to believe that, right? Going all the way back, as you know, to people like, say, James Madison, for example, in the United States, there's a long history of many right-wing liberals or conservative tinged liberals expressing deep reservations against the potential for too much democracy, especially where democracy might threaten capitalist economic relations. And I mean, Madison was extremely explicit about that in Federalist 10. I often tell some of my students that if you read Federalist 10, he almost sounds a bit like a Marxist at points, but just somebody who thinks that the capitalist should win, right? Insisting that, there are fundamentally unequal capacities to acquire property. The job of government is to manage the very severe factions and tensions that emerge precisely from these unequal capacities to acquire property, and to manage them in the favor of the property owners. And this is precisely one of the reasons he gives in Federalist 10 for why we should not be a democracy, because a purely democratical society has ever been a kind of scene of mischief and a threat to property relations. So, Hayek is on solid ground in thinking that some species of liberalism have this kind of wariness of democracy. But liberal socialists, of course, adopt a very different view. So in my book, I talk about how you could see intimations of liberal socialism going all the way back to people like, say, Thomas Paine or Mary Wollstonecraft. Thomas Paine, another one of the great American founding fathers, was in many ways much friendlier to, he wouldn't necessarily call it democracy, but republicanism and representative government than Madison, insisting that all people who are going to be impacted by laws should consequently have a say in laws. And one of the interesting things about Paine is precisely that he didn't have this deep wariness of republicanism because he thought it'd be a threat to property. By the time you get to the rights of man, he's actually quite insistent that property is a social institution. The rich owe society a debt for the maintenance of their property that can be paid through a redistributive and welfare state. So there's no reason to limit Republican participation. Because you're worried that it might be a threat to property, since property is an immutable right anyway. And Mary Wollstonecraft, of course, felt very similarly, right? She was, of course, well known for her vigorous defense of the rights of women, including the rights of women to participate in government. And I think that more or less she's won that argument. Let's just put it that way. Maybe not in some of the darker spheres of the internet, 4chan and stuff, but for the average person. And she also insisted, look, from the inequities of property flow, as though from a poison chalice is her terminology, almost all the kind of corrosive tendencies in our society, because the propensity to reverence wealth and to allow inequalities of wealth to translate into inequalities of power undermines these kinds of Republican virtues and attitudes that are necessary, as she thought, for a free society. And moving forward, just because I've talked a bit, I'll pause here. Almost every liberal socialist will have a similar set of inclinations, although again, they'll understand this in very, very different ways. But by and large, the idea is that more democracy is certainly not a threat. If anything, it would be a boon to society. And that includes, and this is very important to note, economic democracy in addition to political and social democracy.
I think bringing in Tom Paine and Mary Wollstonecraft is very interesting. And in a little while, I'll ask you more about Paine, thinking about Paine, especially his connection not only to the American Revolution, but to later thought around universal and equal rights. I think is very interesting. Mm-hmm. Around that question of the right of universal and equal suffrage. Curious what you think about that right, and if it's useful to ground a political movement or a critique of society, perhaps around the demand for that right. Some, for example, including Paine, I think at times has referred to that as sort of the right of rights, if you will. Curious what you think about that.
Oh, I absolutely think it's extremely important, right? So just by way of biography, right? To be a bit narcissistic for a second, my PhD dissertation was a kind of mixture of critical legal analysis, but it kind of cashed itself out by arguing for an expansion of the right to vote in Canada, the United States, and Europe. So I'm very, very committed to this. And I think it's really noteworthy that amongst the developed democracies, although there's been some pretty profound backsliding recently, the U.S. is kind of distinctive in not having a constitutional right to vote guaranteed to all citizens. Now, there are limitations on how you can restrict the right to vote baked into the U.S. Constitution. Right? You can't abridge suffrage on the grounds of race, for example, after the second founding. But even that does not mean that you can't abridge suffrage for any other number of different reasons. And of course, many American southern states very easily found workarounds to abridge the right to vote on the basis of rates by imposing things like, poll taxes in order to vote, or requiring that someone pay poll taxes in order to vote, or literacy tests, et cetera, et cetera. And, again, this wasn't an accident. It's not as though the founders just forgot to put the right to vote in there. There were some significant deliberations about how far suffrage should be expanded and whether it should be granted constitutional protections. And the more critical figures who were wary of democracy, people like John Adams or Madison, again, decided that there was no need to put this kind of emphasis on the right to vote, let alone include it in the Constitution. And I think that was a major error. And the reason it's a major error is for reasons that Jefferson and the other drafters of the Declaration of Independence understood very well, right? Where if you read the Declaration of Independence closely, they're very clear that, the most important thing for people to pursue is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But then there's immediately an awareness of the fact that if government is not able to facilitate one's pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, amongst the different rights and indeed amongst the duties that people have, is precisely to alter their form of government. And what this reflects in a kind of Republican vein is a recognition on the part of Jefferson and the other drafters of the Declaration of Independence that it's not just what we might call negative freedom that's important for a liberal society to secure. We also need to secure a high degree of social or civic freedom, as it's sometimes called. People even sometimes describe it as the Roman conception of freedom, this idea that we should be, if not quite authors of the laws that govern us directly, at least have a say in the laws that govern us, because this is necessary in order to protect all the other rights to more private activities that we think are absolutely integral. And I think you can see the wisdom of this outlook throughout American history, right? What is it that women and the civil rights movement agitated for before they agitated for almost anything else? Well, it was the right to vote. And there's a reason for this. And there's also a reason why reactionary forces tried very hard to prevent them from getting the right to vote. It's because once you have the right to vote, you have a certain amount of power in society that you didn't before. And that means that authorities have to be accountable to you in a certain way. And of course, this means that those who benefit from existing inequities of power don't want to grant people the right to vote, especially those that they consider their so-called natural subordinates, right? So I think that once understood this way, we can recognize how integral civic or social freedom is to the well-being of any liberal citizen. Putting aside even, the kind of virtuous qualities that come from democratic participation. And I think that we can see why it's so vital to protect the right to vote from the kind of restrictions and rollbacks that many authoritarian governments are trying to impose today.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I think about in regards to what universal and equal suffrage means is especially around our Senate. The fact
Yes.
that we have a Senate in which each state gets 2 representatives, regardless of how many folks there are. And the way I had heard it put before and then actually saw it put really for the first time in writing, especially in a academic work, in Aziz Rana's book, The Constitutional Bind, was
Yes.
that our particular political system is an affront to just the general idea of universal and equal suffrage. If you kind of expand that to thinking about, well, the right to vote for a Supreme Court, the right to directly elect a president, it would seem then that the demand for universal and equal suffrage could be expanded perhaps beyond just kind of universal access to the ballot, but also start critiquing some of these other systems.
Oh, yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh, without a doubt, right? I mean, Aziz Rana's The Constitutional Bind, just to kind of pause for a moment of praise, is a revelatory book, right? Indeed, I'd be willing to go so far as to say it's a book that many of us have wanted someone to write for a very long time. And it's nice that it's finally out there in the world, because what I think he makes very clear, and there are others who have kind of emphasized this as well, is that in many ways, the American Constitution, which is an innovative document in a lot of ways, right? I don't want to be too critical of it, is not a facilitator of a democratic form of life, but precisely a barrier to a robustly democratic way of life, the way that many Americans aspire to. And there are many different aspects to this. Again, not guaranteeing the right to vote, I think, is just the most egregious, noteworthy one. But let's go to the example you give, 2 senators per state. Erwin Chemerinsky, the dean of UC Berkeley Law, author of a classic book on constitutional interpretation, wrote a very good short little polemic recently called No Democracy Lasts Forever. And what Professor Chemerinsky points out in that book with regard to senators is that almost every other part of the Constitution can be amended. And this was the very small kind of offering some of the founders were willing to give to democratic pressures, since democracies should be entitled to revise the Constitution. But one of the things they did not allow for change, even under the amending formula, is that each state is going to have 2 senators, no matter how large. And this, of course, enormously concentrates legislative power in the hands of small states who are by and large more conservative, not exclusively, but for the most part. And it's fundamentally contrary to our democratic ethos to allow what was once a very elitist institution this kind of leeway over how the whole country is governed. So, look, I'm willing to accept that purely proportional representation needs to be counterbalanced against other kinds of concerns, right? I'm not saying that everything needs to be exactly in a one-to-one correlation in terms of how much representation the state gets and their overall population. Just to give one example, in Canada, where I'm from, right, the northern parts of the country, the territories, are each allocated 1 MP per territory, even though their populations are far lower than other kinds of ridings where you'd get 1 MP. And I think that's fine, right? These are very, very large districts with complicated histories and by and large indigenous communities. And the effect of this kind of, what's the way to put it? The effect of like this kind of more powerful representation is fairly minimal, right? But the Senate has an enormous influence on U.S. politics, and you should not have a context where the Democrats, for instance, need to win 55% of the popular vote in a midterm year in order to win 50 seats in the Senate. That's just ridiculous, right? And I think fundamentally we need to do something about that. Although how to go about that is a very, very difficult question because, as Chemerinsky points out, there's no amending formula for getting rid of it, which would mean we basically have to rewrite the Constitution. And certainly when the country is divided the way it is right now, it's very easy to say, or very tempting to say, good luck with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree that Rana's work is groundbreaking, and there seem to be, just in general, very little that's been written about popular interpretation of the Constitution, how
Yes.
kind of the people see it, let alone, but then also how the left and political activists have thought about it and interacted with it. And then also Chemerinsky, I think the fact that the dean of the UC Berkeley Law School is writing a book like this, talking about the Constitution, is symbolic of the period we're living in, or the ideas that are kind of coming to folks' minds.
Absolutely right. I mean, not to sound too much like an old leftist, but there's that meme where some people say the system is broken and needs to be repaired, and then there's the more radical personality who I tend to agree with on this institute, who says the system is working the way it's intended to and needs to be completely reconstructed. Right. And one of the things that Rana makes very clear at epic length, it's not a short book, right, is that one of the serious barriers to democratization in the United States is what he calls creedal constitutionalism. Right, this propensity to ascribe almost divine insight to the founding fathers, while failing to recognize that the Constitution that they designed had one job primarily, which was to unify the country and to prevent a kind of fundamental breakdown. And it didn't even succeed at that, right? 70 years after the Constitution was adopted, there was a massive civil war. The country tore itself apart. And there was this requirement for a new founding, or a second founding, as it's sometimes called, to fundamentally remake the constitutional order in a way that should have been carried out initially, right? Because it's very possible that someone who was living at the time when the Constitution was adopted would live long enough to see the period when it all broke down, right? So this is an important thing to continuously stress, I think, because there are a lot of good things to the American Constitution. I don't want to deny that, right? I happen to think that a strong emphasis on things like freedom of expression, which is very much a part of the American constitutional heritage, is something that many Americans can be extremely proud of, right? But this hagiography ascribed to the founders and to the document is, qua Rana and Chemerinsky, a barrier to thinking through how many of the problems in the United States right now aren't a result of deviating too far from the Constitution. They're the result of the Constitution doing what it's supposed to do, which is to entrench minoritarian rule, and people are just sick of it. But until they realize that the Constitution facilitates these problems rather than inhibits them, we're not going to get as far as we need to go.
I wanted to turn to some of the figures and also some of the specific ideas that come up, I believe, not just in your most recent book, but in various articles you've written. One of the people you talk about is C.B. Macpherson, who is someone I was only recently introduced to. I sometimes think I should have been more familiar with him, having studied sociology, but whatever. I'm coming to him now. So the Democratic Constitution blog, we're hosting a reading group that is attempting to retrace the history of equal human and political rights and democratic republicanism.
Cool.
And thank you. And we're talking about the English peasants' revolt and the levelers. And we discuss Macpherson and his argument, as I understand it, as we understand it, that the promise of a modern liberal democratic welfare state to provide an equal opportunity for every individual to really develop their potential could not be fulfilled because of this idea of possessive individualism, and that comes from the capitalist market, and that really undermines the professed goal of inequality. And that Macpherson traces the source of this possessive market ideology back to theorists during the during the English Civil War, including Locke and John Locke and the Levelers. And what we're trying to do is bring in this contention that Macpherson perhaps saw the U.S. as a democracy, a fully flourishing democracy, and therefore basically concluded that the U.S. was a democracy, and therefore didn't think that making the state democratic, correcting these problems that we've just talked about, was the path out of capitalism, that there was a different path out. And of course, what we're trying to do is put forward this idea of universal and equal rights, and basically say that a lot of the ideas of the Levelers have yet to be achieved in their full promise here in the United States. So I wanted to ask you two things. One, why you think Macpherson is important, and why you include him in your work, and then also if you agree with this assessment of his thinking that I just laid out.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot there. So I'm going to take this bit by bit. Maybe I'll move from the more theoretical question to the more practical question. Is that cool?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, that just seems like an organic way to go. So for those of your listeners who don't know, C.B. Macpherson was a seminal Canadian political theorist, taught at the University of Toronto for most of his career, is most famous for his text, The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism, which essentially tells the story of how what we might call classical liberalism and its various genetic offspring appeared, but also, and less well known, actually famous for his idea of retrieval, right? Which is where I draw inspiration from. And the idea of retrieval, qua Macpherson, is he said, look, it's very possible to go back to traditions like liberalism and to recover core egalitarian and democratic insights that various thinkers propounded, and to reconstruct them to argue for a more just kind of, say, liberal politics than what possessive individualism may allow. But very briefly, the possessive individualist outlook, as defended by Hobbes and Locke, they're the two major figures, and Bentham, I should add, in his later work, not so much in that book, is basically that human beings come into the world, we're anthropologically self-interested, and for the most part indifferent to other people, maybe not our families, but pretty much everyone else. And we compete with one another for scarce resources, either in the state of nature through war or in the marketplace, right? Where we're constantly trying to one-up one another in order to acquire more. And this is because, by and large, as Macpherson understood it, the kind of ethic that emerges from this from this anthropology is one of a kind of crude utilitarian gratification, right? According to the possessive individualist, I come into the world individually minded and owning my fundamental faculties, which I can then sell to another person like a capitalist or alienate for a wage. And through the various processes that I engage in socially, my constant goal is to maximize my individual utility, to acquire as much stuff as possible in order to gratify as many of my desires as possible, if you want to put it very simply. And one of the things that Macpherson points out, and this goes back to the democracy point, is very often many of the early classical liberals or possessive individualist liberals were somewhat enthusiastic about marginal forms of democratic reform, marginal kinds of democratic reform, because they felt that the authoritarian state, this isn't Hobbes, of course, but people like Locke and Bentham, would inhibit people's ability to maximize their utility by inhibiting certain kinds of essential freedom that are necessary in order to participate in the market economy. But Macpherson also points out what's really telling is that in instances where they had to make a choice between, say, more equality and more democracy, and more of the market kind of society that was emerging at the time, they almost invariably made the decision that prioritizing the market was more important than prioritizing democracy, equal rights for all, equal flourishing. A classic example of this is Macpherson's treatment of Jeremy Bentham, who some people might know as arguably one of the founders of modern utilitarian, and arguably one of the founders of modern utilitarianism. It had antecedents. But Bentham, was confronted by this problem, which is that if you follow utilitarianism through to what seems like its natural conclusion, you would just say, well, if we want to maximize the greatest happiness for the greatest number, it's probably better to have a more equal society than what the market would permit. Why? Well, if we follow this democratic ethos that each counts as one and no more than one, we should try to redistribute goods so that more or less everyone has the same shot at a good life. And Bentham said, yeah, that's where my theory seems to lead, but we're not going to do that because this would fundamentally inhibit this drive that's necessary in order to induce economic efficiency, this kind of competitive urge, and it would also violate property rights. So in these kinds of instances, it'll be better off for us to kind of double down on the importance of property rights and competition than move in the direction of a more kind of egalitarian utilitarianism. And notably, John Stuart Mill, who was a liberal socialist, made the opposite choice. Right? Now, how does this cash itself out? Well, again, Macpherson was extremely critical of possessive individualism and classical liberalism, and for that matter, its kind of emerging descendants like neoliberalism. Around when he died, this was just starting to come into vogue. But he wasn't uniformly critical of liberalism, which is something that I think a lot of people don't understand. In a lot of his works, he actually, again, tried to enact a retrieval of what he saw as the more progressive dimensions of the liberal tradition, focusing on people like John Stuart Mill, who he says very much breaks with this kind of Benthamite ethos, instead foregrounds the importance of universal suffrage with some marginal exceptions, right? Well, not even marginal. Some of them are relatively important, and we can get into that. But the idea is that participating in democracy will help people develop their fundamental capacities, which, according to Mill, is something that is a lot more important for many of us than just acquiring a lot of stuff to gratify our hedonic urges. And through the 1960s and 1970s, Macpherson was actually somewhat optimistic about the future of liberal democracy, and it might be hard to figure out why from our 2025 standpoint, but think about it, right? This was the era of the great welfare states and the great society. This was also the kind of moment where the civil rights movement had just achieved major victories for enfranchisement in the United States. And Macpherson looked at all this and said, look, by and large, liberal democracy is imperfect, but it seems to kind of be moving in the direction that it's supposed to. So it's definitely not an irredeemable project. We just need to keep on pushing these tendencies in the direction that they need to go in. Well, by the 1980s, he was starting to become a little bit more wary, let's just call it that things weren't quite moving in the right direction. But then he passed away, of course, as we all do. And so he never really had time to develop a systematic critique of let's call it the Reagan-Thatcher, I can't in there, Mulroney paradigm, which would have been very insightful had he had time to do so. But I think had he lived to today, he'd be horrified to see what's happened to liberal democracy, and probably would wonder how the hell we made such a mess of everything.
And is it his attempt to emphasize these liberal rights, if you will, within a political tradition that really stands out about him? What is it exactly that draws you to him in your work?
Well, there's a few things. One is his extremely nuanced understanding of the liberal tradition, which obviously as a liberal socialist I identify with. Right, Macpherson was extremely critical of the anti-democratic, competitive, and kind of vulgar strains of possessive individualism that permeated liberal society. Indeed, it'd be hard-pressed to find anybody who was more critical than him of this. But he also recognized that there were many redeeming features to liberalism, right? Its emphasis on universal rights for all, ideally, of course. Its stress on the importance of various forms of democratic and Republican participation, which, again, he was very familiar with. And later on, by the 20th century, this strong emphasis on the importance of securing economic well-being for everyone through various redistributive mechanisms. And he said, look, if you go back in the liberal tradition to people like John Stuart Mill, right, again, none of this should be foreign to us, right, or strange to us. Mill was very clear, certainly in his late period, that a kind of market socialism was completely compatible, even required by a commitment to liberalism. Why? Because liberals should be committed to what Macpherson calls in Mill a developmental rather than an acquisitive ethic. An acquisitive ethic is, again, what you find in Locke, Hobbes and Bentham. This idea that the point of life is just to acquire as much stuff as I can for myself to gratify my desires, and I have to outcompete anyone in order to do that. Then so be it. Whereas Mill pointed out, look, no, we're much closer to something like Aristotle's social animals than Hobbes's, fundamentally competitive man engaged in a war of all against all. That doesn't mean we're naively, all good to each other, but it does mean that we, by and large, benefit from each other's companies and cooperate with one another to try to obtain the conditions where everyone can flourish, because your flourishing can very well be a condition for my flourishing if we cohabit in the same kind of space. And Mill cashed this out again in terms of a support for a kind of market socialism with a welfare state that was quite robust, and an argument for worker-run cooperatives, et cetera, et cetera. And Macpherson thought that all of this was a sign that we could retrieve core insights from the liberal tradition to help save liberalism from its own worst inclinations by moving it towards a participatory or developmental democracy. He uses various different terms to describe this. And I think it's an extremely attractive idea, right? I think that a good society would be one that looks a lot more like, say, Sweden or Norway or Denmark, certainly than the United States under Trump, right? Or Canada under Stephen Harper, right, who I grew up with, which isn't to say that those countries are utopias in any way, shape, or form, because I don't think we're ever going to have utopia. But there is a lot to be said about a society that secures high levels of liberal rights for all, and where if you lose your job, you're not going to wind up on the street in a couple of weeks, because there's a safety mechanism that we all provide in order to insulate everyone from the worst potentials in human life.
One thing that's coming to mind in thinking about Macpherson, and this is a little bit off the cuff, but his place in, for example, Aziz Rana's discussion of constitutional critique, the critique of American democracy, because it, as I said, it can be easy for me to say, looking back, well, here's someone who missed something and that they should have seen. They should have been more critical of the U.S. Constitution, for example, and seen the Senate or seen the Supreme Court as a problem or something like that. But also thinking about their position in a particular time, in a particular place, interacting with these ideas. So I'm tempted to think, and I'll bring this up with other people too, that if these people were here today with us in 2025 looking at the U.S. Constitution, that they'd be very critical of it. But I'm not sure. Perhaps that's too much speculation and so on.
It's definitely possible, right? Thomas Jefferson was famously quite insistent that the earth belongs to the living, and that we should have a constitutional convention every 18, 20 years so that each generation is able to provide its input into the fundamental laws that are going to govern it. And again, that's a very nice democratic idea in some respects, right? It's this idea that we should be authors of the laws that govern us, or at the very least have a say in the laws that govern us. Or, again, we can talk about Thomas Paine. Paine was extremely insistent on the importance of ordinary people having a say in how their government was run. And he was obviously enormously proud of the American Republic, which in many ways was a much more democratic society than almost any other in the world at that time. But I have no doubt that if he were to arrive in the United States today and saw an administration staffed by billionaires from front to back, he would start saying, it's time to, get out those banners and begin marching again, and, to release the 2025 version of common sense and how wasteful aristocratic rule is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I hope so, at the very least. But to, link this back to the Macphersonian point, I think it's also important not to overstress or overemphasize the radicalness of some aspects of American revolutionary thought. So one of the kind of characteristics of the attitude of the Founding Fathers is just how anti-egalitarian they were in some respects. Even the most egalitarian among them, like Thomas Jefferson, famously agreed with John Adams that there was a natural aristocracy, to use his terminology, in society, and that a good constitutional and a good political order would be one that allowed for the election and elevation of this natural aristocracy. And this, of course, is not just an abstract idea. It's very much baked in to American constitutional and political culture. This idea that the difference between us and old Europe is in old Europe, there's this kind of calcified aristocracy that achieves this position because of birth, whereas in America, anyone can make it with hard work, grit, and some talent, right? And then they can rise all the way up to the top. While a lot of people have pointed out that if you took that idea seriously, including Macpherson, it's very hard to say that America embodies it in a way, shape, or form, right? The vast majority of affluent people in this country inherited most of their wealth, right? That includes Donald Trump, right? Or, Elon Musk, his dad owned an emerald mine, right? Certainly he got a lot richer, but he started off with some pretty significant advantages. Let's put it that way, right? And I'm not the first person to point out that if you wanted to look for a country where social mobility is much more of a reality, again, Sweden, Norway, Denmark are places where the American dream of rising from the bottom to the top is much more alive than in the United States right now, where for the most part, with few exceptions, if you're born rich, you stay rich, or you get richer. And if you're born poor, well, that's going to be your lot in life, right? But say that we were able to actually create something that genuinely looked like Jefferson's natural aristocracy or Adams' natural aristocracy. Well, here Macpherson would probably say that might actually be worse in some respects. Why? Because you'd have a ruling class that, very much like our ruling class now, except far less deserved, genuinely felt that it owed nothing to the people at the bottom, that it had risen to the top through its own efforts and through its own aptitudes, and consequently didn't have to make any kind of effort to improve the situation of those who were at the base of society because they deserve to be there. And even more toxic, this is Michael Sandel's point in The Theory of Merit. The people at the bottom would think, if I wasn't able to rise, that's because I am, to use the proper Trumpese, a loser. I had my shot, I took it, I couldn't make it because I'm not good enough. And so if I'm here cleaning toilets and I have no political power whatsoever, that's where I belong. Or that's where I'm told I belong, right? Now, I think there are very good Rawlsian reasons to be critical of the entire idea of natural aristocracy or meritocracy. I think that that's a kind of mythic way of thinking about things that is just unsustainable to anyone who looks at the real world. But this attitude that we can achieve something like a natural aristocracy based on merit is one that has had an enormously corrosive effect on American political culture. And I think it's one of the reasons why across the board, everyone is getting really tired of elites, whether liberal elites and educated elites or wealthy elites, looking down on them. I just think that, unfortunately, it's mainly been the political right that's been the beneficiary of this animus so far.
We've touched a little bit on Paine, and we've done other episodes on Paine. And one thing I think is interesting about Paine, though, is that he's not necessarily seen as a central or important figure on the left, or at least not in the left spaces that I
Sure.
was used to at one point. And so I'm curious what you see in Paine. I now, for example, see a lot of inspiration in the Pennsylvania Constitution, which he played a part in drafting in 1776. This idea that we've talked about, that the dead have no right to rule the living must make their own political institutions. His emphasis on the importance of universal and equal voting rights. His understanding, I think, too, that social and economic problems needed to be solved through political struggle, that these were questions of politics. And I think a lot of his values have yet to be achieved here in the U.S., and in that way is a very important figure to look at. So curious what you see in Paine and what you draw from him and why you include him in your work.
Well, I think that you'll be happy to know that things are changing pretty
Oh,
rapidly. Actually, just today, Jacobin magazine tweeted out a happy birthday to Thomas Paine, as they
hmm.
called him the most radical of the American revolutionaries. Right. So I think that there's a growing awareness of the fact that he very much belongs on the kind of left end of the spectrum, and that he's certainly a figure whose prestige and insights the left should claim and learn more from. Right. But in terms of his value as a thinker. Gosh, there's just so many things to say about him, right? I mean, I love reading Thomas Paine. That's one of the things that's actually just great about him, right? A lot of philosophers and figures that political theorists admire. They're bad writers. They're kind of boring, and they're very smart, but you have to kind of plod along. Paine isn't like that, right? He writes in this kind of glittering prose style. He's always extremely funny, and he writes in a way that is extremely accessible, which is actually, I suppose, where I can come down on the two things that I think the left today could learn from Thomas Paine, including the liberal left. First off, I think that one of the things that Paine is extremely good at is he's very, very smart, but he never comes across as over intellectualized. If you look at the title of his most famous work, Common Sense, it tells you an awful lot, right? I think that a lot of us on the left, probably because many of us come from academic, artistic, and radical backgrounds, like to present ourselves as radically upending the status quo, right? Doing something that is daring, new, completely, unheard of before. Now, Paine realized that that's what the American revolutionaries were doing, right? I mean, his famous quote, plagiarized by Ronald Reagan, as we have it in our power to begin the world anew, right? But Paine was savvy enough to know that if you're going to argue for a radical change, it needs to be radical change understood in the true sense of the Latin radix, rooted, right? You don't present this as some kind of radical break from the status quo. You say that these reforms are common sense, right? That this is just something that should have been carried out a long time ago, needs to be carried out, and any good thinking person would realize that this is the right route forward. And I think once you present your ideas as common sense and have them accepted by such, it's a lot easier to gain political momentum because you've enacted a kind of counter hegemonic shift in people's attitudes about things. And you really see this in very effectively in all Paine's works, where he doesn't sit there and have these kind of fire and brimstone attitudes towards the aristocracy. His point is usually to say, what a ridiculous idea to say that the king is the father of the people. The king in some countries is 12 years old, right? We don't even trust 12-year-olds to manage a butcher shop or a bakery, let alone an entire kingdom. And yet he's supposed to be, the father of me and my family. Come on, guys, let's just get real here. It's very hard to kind of argue with that rhetoric. And that leads me to the second thing that I think he is extremely gifted at in a way that's been underappreciated. So a lot of my writing is on the political right and equality, right? And a lot of people don't know this, but Paine engaged in what can only be described as an epic debate with Edmund Burke, who, as many of your listeners might know, is probably the chief and most intelligent defender of a kind of wary attitude towards the revolutionary era and the French Revolution in particular. So about the first half, or part one, I should say, of The Rights of Man, is intended as a rebuttal of Burke. And he really shows very effectively how progressives and liberals can argue against the right. Because Burke was prone to these kinds of flowery forms of ostentation, right? Arguing that we need to ascribe sublime qualities onto the monarchy, arguing that the problem with the French Revolution is that all the pleasing illusions that bound society together were being stripped away, claiming that the true social contract was between the living, the dead, and those yet to be born, right? This kind of Gothic compact. And as Mary Wollstonecraft said, there's this kind of mortal antipathy to reason in a lot of these kind of flowery affectations. They're quite beautiful in some respects, but when you start to really probe them intellectually, they begin to break apart. And Paine was extremely good at skewering precisely this pretentious, bombastic mode of reactionary discourse. A very good example that he never tired of pointing to is he says, look, Burke says that we should revere the monarchies of Europe for having proven themselves providentially over a long period of time. But I can tell you that the English monarchy is anything but providentially ordained. We actually know when the modern English monarchy appeared. It was in 1066, and it's because William the Conqueror hired a band of mercenaries, crossed the English Channel, killed the then legitimate king of England, Harold Godwinson, then butchered his way across the country until there was no one left to threaten him any longer. And then him and his descendants have been taxing the English people very, very heavily ever since then, right? And he says, once you realize this, you kind of can't but come to the conclusion that most of the monarchs were something very much like criminals, right? Who just used the power of a gangster to erect themselves above everyone else. And once you kind of approach things that way, all of this kind of flowery ostentation, even kind of sentimental mush that people like Burke try to ascribe onto the monarchy, it loses a lot of its power. And I think that this mode of arguing with the right, presenting oneself as a kind of avatar of common sense against this kind of pretentious affectation is a really useful one that the right needs to learn to recover in its debates with the right. I think that too much left-wing writing kind of pivots away from that to its own forms of affectation that make it very easy for right-wingers to paint us as anti-populist, anti-common sense, and all of that kind of stuff.
That's very interesting, thinking about writing style, the way of presenting ideas. I'm often thinking about that a lot myself as someone who's trying to write more, how to talk about things, how to get your point across, how to connect with people. And I think you're right. There's certainly a lot that can be taken from Paine in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially today, right? I mean, the right perennially tries to present itself as a populist party, even as it's, again, staffing its administrations with more billionaires than any other. And when you read the writings of right-wing intellectuals, they seem determined to almost outdo Burke in their kind of sclerotic, bombastic, kind of flowery, even kind of, just use content, cringy, kind of aestheticization of politics, constantly ascribing all these sublime qualities onto somebody like Donald fucking Trump, let alone Elon Musk, right? And I think if Paine were here today, he'd know exactly what to do, right? You don't sit there and try to present the right as these dark satanic geniuses or extremely threatening figures, although they can be that, who are trying to destroy everything and have a grand plan for how to remake the country. You present them as, in many ways, what they really are, right? A bunch of pampered daddies and mama's boys who have never worked an honest job in their life and just figure that they are God's gift to the universe and are entitled to rule over his entire creation, including all of us. And Paine would say, we shouldn't have that, right? Ordinary people are the ones who actually built this country and build this country day in and day out, and they're the ones who should be in charge. Definitely not a billionaire and another billionaire.
One thing I wanted to ask you about as we start to wind down, I've got two more questions here for you, including this one. This the Republican concepts of freedom and domination, and you've written about this a bit, including in your article, "The Political Tradition of Republicanism Should Be a Touchstone for Democratic Socialists." And this idea has been interesting to me for a little while. I spoke recently with Alexander Gorovich and pressed him a little about what I felt like was a lack of political analysis in his discussion, his article co-authored with Corey Robbins in 2020 article "Freedom Now." And I feel like too often discussions about republicanism, Republican freedom, miss a key insight, which is, in my opinion, the lack of democracy that we have here in the US. And that there could be a very potent combination, if you will, between Gorovich's demand, for example, of freedom now, and the lack of freedom that we have within our existing political system. And then to take a quote from that article that you wrote, we want the freedom to create a freer society. And I hear that and think, yes, we want the political freedom. We want a political structure that can actually facilitate our ability to create a free society, to do anything in society, really. So I'm curious, my question as written is, do you think the struggle for freedom includes creating a democratic political system? That seems a little silly because I feel like your response is, of course, yes. But what you think about these ideas of Republican freedoms, your article, what I put forward, curious about that.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to that. Right now, I want to be clear. I haven't thought through comprehensively yet how to link this to my own project of agitating for liberal socialism. Although in the book, I make very clear that a liberal socialist society would be one characterized by non-domination and would be deeply committed to the idea of extending democratic freedoms, not just into political institutions where they're imperfectly applied, even in countries like the United States, but also into the economy. So just take a step back here, right? The basic idea of Republican freedom is as non-domination. And the example that I usually give to make this clear is one that's brought up by Quentin Skinner and others. Imagine that you are a slave with a very kindly master, right? And this master paid you a wage, more or less let you do whatever it is that you wanted, encouraged you to live your life as you thought was appropriate. And for the most part, slavery was a kind of background condition or a background feature of your life that you had a peripheral awareness of. Would we say that slave is free? Well, the answer is no, because they are still subject to the dominion or will of another, in this case, the master, who can choose at any point that he or she wishes to be less kindly and less non-domineering, let's put it that way, and to resubjugate you in a much more direct and immediate way. And of course, these aren't just hypothetical scenarios. Frederick Douglass, to give one example, was well educated by his master through much of his early life, taught him how to read and how to write, until apparently around the time he was a teenager, they thought he was getting a little bit too precocious for his own good, and decided that educating slaves was a bad idea, and he wasn't going to be educated any longer, right? Which, from the standpoint of the self-interest of slave owners, was probably a right idea. But we were all very fortunate they kind of made that mistake, right? Since we all got to Frederick Douglass, who was a major figure to advancing freedom across the globe. So the way that this connects to politics is that a society characterized by non-domination would be one where no one is subject to the arbitrary will of another, including politically, and I would add in the workplace. And this is going to mean, of course, that emphasizing things like civic or social freedom is extremely important, because if people are not capable of authoring the laws that govern them, or at least having a say in the laws that govern them, even if they're left more or less to their own devices every day, it's always very possible that will be taken away since they're not able to influence the authorities that govern them. And this includes to follow people like Liz Anderson in the workplace, right? So Liz Anderson is a professor at the University of Michigan, author of a very interesting book called Private Government. One of the points that she makes in this book that has a kind of Republican quality to it is she says, look, if you were to ask the average American, do you think it would be okay for the government to tell you when to wake up, what clothes you're going to wear, when you're going to go to the washroom, when you're allowed to eat lunch? There would be a revolution the next day, right? Because people just would not stand for the government doing that. But we allow private government, as she calls it, these kinds of entitlements everywhere across the economy. We just think it's entirely appropriate that when I enter into the workforce, all the kinds of civic rights that I need to protect, that are used to protect my rights, just fall by the wayside, and we enter into these kind of miniature dictatorships. And she says this is a really good indicator of the need to extend democratic values into the economy and into the workplace, because why shouldn't workers have a say in how their firms are managed? We think that that's entirely appropriate in the political sphere. And the reality is that for many Americans, their interaction with the state is comparatively minimal next to their interaction with their boss, right? I'm guessing if you had to ask most Americans how often they think about politics, it'd be a lot less, let's put it that way, than they think about work. And I think she makes a very compelling argument in those circumstances. So I think moving towards a society characterized by less domination, where people are freer in this robust Republican sense, would require radical changes in the way socio and economic and political structures are organized. However, per my previous claim, I think that in many ways, these aren't these wouldn't be reforms that are contrary to values that many Americans say that they hold to. I think they just constitute the organic and logical next step of extending these values into areas where, for far too long, because of the self-interest of capital, people have just said those don't apply here, and I think they should.
It's interesting. Just as a side note, yesterday, an event in Mexico, there was someone asking the question of how the left in Mexico should think about ideas of freedom and democracy and what those words even mean to us. And I found myself thinking, okay, even in other countries, this idea of what freedom, domination, democracy means are being brought up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, Mexico is an interesting country too, because the country only transitioned to being a full competitive democracy about 25 years ago, right? And the sad reality is, in some respects, Mexico might even be a more robust competitive democracy than the U.S. is right now, right? There are 3 political parties, each of whom has a shot at winning. There's been a transition between them over the last little while, and yeah, I mean, none of us expected that it would be carried out that quickly.
I wanted to ask you to, as we wrap up, I wanted to ask you this question about socialism and the political demands that socialists, not always, but at various points have made. So you talk about socialist legal systems and equal rights, and that's something, for example, you discuss in your article, Democratic Socialism can make liberal rights real. When I think about a socialist legal system, what I like to draw on, or I'll say it like this, when I think about socialism and the law making legal demands, I focus on this demand for a democratic republic. So Engels's statement in 1893 that Marx and I for 40 years repeated ad nauseum, that for us the democratic republic is the political form in which the struggle between the working class and the capitalist class can be universalized and culminate in the decisive victory of the proletariat, to quote Engels. The Russian Social Democratic Labor Party's 1903 program, which includes as its first 2 points sovereignty of the people. By that, they're talking about the concentration of supreme state power in the hands of a legislative assembly elected by universal and equal suffrage. They also then make that demand explicitly for universal, equal, and direct suffrage. And then something that was very influential in my political development was reading the Socialist Party of America's 1912 platform, which talks about abolishing judicial review, electing judges to short terms, directly electing the president and the vice president, getting rid of the Senate, drafting a new constitution, so on and so forth. I just had no idea that socialists talked about the law, legal institutions, the demand for a democratic republic. So I was curious how you think these demands, these ideas that socialists of old have put forward and really emphasized. There was a little pin. I think we see some of those ideas in today's Democratic Socialists of America. But how these statements, how these demands fit into your conception, your ideas of socialism, rights, the law? That's a big question, but wanted to throw those into the mix.
Yeah, absolutely, right. So it's important to note that socialism, like liberalism, and for that matter, like conservatism or the right, is a very broad family of different views, ideological inclinations, etc., that share a kind of family resemblance to one another. But just like there are many members of your family that you probably don't like or even wonder how you're related, there are some species of socialism, like, say, authoritarian socialism or command economy socialism, that I think have rightly been severely criticized and that have no place in any responsible discussion about political forms that we should be trying to adopt. But what I think a lot of Americans especially aren't aware of is that the kind of socialism that people associate with the Soviet Union is hardly exhaustive and not even representative, certainly not if you look around the globe, right? Socialists in countries like Western Europe, Canada, Mexico, for that matter, have all been at the forefront of struggles for democratic equality, for basic liberal rights, and of course, for a more egalitarian and more humane economy, and oftentimes very successfully, I should add, right? And this includes Marx and Engels, right? So Marx and Engels, from the very beginning of their career, were fierce proponents of the necessity of certain kinds of liberal rights or the rights of man. Now, they were critical of the limitations of those rights, but Marx saw his newspapers shut down one after another, and not coincidentally, he was a vigorous defender of the idea of freedom of speech, for example. Right. In fact, Marx was such a vigorous defender of freedom of speech that he once said that the state has no right to abridge it under any kind of circumstances because that will mutilate the expression of the public's will. Marx and Engels were also vigorous proponents of the idea of universal suffrage. It makes a lot of sense when you think of the 19th century. They absolutely wanted the working class enfranchised because by the 1870s, 1880s, Marx was even predicting that in countries like the United States or the United Kingdom, there might be a peaceful road to socialism that was possible through electoral transformations if we were able to franchise the working class and if the working class decided to democratize society sufficiently, right? And in the broader socialist tradition, just moving away from Marx and Engels for a second, you see many different iterations of this. So the essay of mine that you're writing draws a lot of inspiration from Christine Sipnowich, who's a professor at Queen's University, author of a very interesting book on G.A. Cohen. But the text I refer to there is The Concept of Socialist Law, where she tries to talk about what a humane, rights-respecting socialist legal system would look like. And she actually draws from a lot of Canadian examples, right, by saying, look, in Canada, right, there's this recognition that rights are just as much social as they are individual. And she points out that this is something that has been known going all the way back to John Stuart Mill, right? John Stuart Mill pointed out that any right that I have as an individual imposes unchosen duties upon literally everyone else in humanity to accept my right to that, right? So there's always this social kind of dimension to this. And she says, once you recognize that rights are of this social quality to them, in addition to being for the benefit of individuals, you realize this idea that there's some kind of stark contrast between negative and positive rights is an entirely artificial one, right? Any kind of negative right you impose upon people, that you grant to people, is going to impose impositions on others. And any kind of positive right that you give to people will also impose certain obligations, for instance, on state actors to provision you with the necessities of a good life. And she says, precisely also for when we recognize the social dimension of rights, we recognize how important democracy is, because as a society, we need to choose together what kind of rights we think are necessary to secure the flourishing of all our individuals. And she thinks that the socialist tradition has done a better job than most in recognizing this social quality of rights and the need for a democratic form of life in order to meaningfully instantiate rights for all. And I think that's a very attractive and ideal. And I think that you can recognize its influence, again, in countries that are highly successful, the Nordic states, many Western European democracies, even Canada, through the implementation of things like universal healthcare. And I would hope that we could resurrect that idea in its best and most palatable form today, while also, of course, being critical of it where it was limited, because socialism is most definitely not a perfect tradition. There are a lot of problems and a lot of bad socialists out there and a lot of bad socialist thinking. And much like, liberalism has needed to correct itself over time, there are a lot of features of socialism that I think need to be corrected.
Well, Matt, I really appreciate having you on. We could talk about these topics for hours and hours. But what I will do is of course, link these articles and reference your book in the description of the podcast. I encourage listeners to check that out and continue engaging with these ideas. And I think what you've discussed in terms of the importance of Paine, the history of liberalism, how we communicate with people, thinking about Marx and Engels, the idea of rights not just as kind of individualistic things, but as eminently social and political demands, I think is also very important. So appreciate you engaging in a really wide-ranging discussion with us.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Luke. It was great chatting. And if any of your listeners want to get in touch with me, I'm not hard to find. Just shoot me an email or reach out to me on social media. I'll try to get back in touch with you as soon as I can.